Imagine for a second, right, that you're sitting at this massive, imposing wooden desk. It's June 1925. You are a filmmaker in the Soviet Union, and the government has just handed you a mandate that is going to entirely dictate the next 6 months of your life. And they don't just want a movie.
Right.
They want a sweeping, monumental, cinematic panorama.
Yeah.
A massive visual history lesson commemorating the 20th anniversary of the 1905 popular uprising. So you have the weight of an entire political apparatus just bearing down on you, expecting this masterpiece that will, validate their history to the world.
Oh, absolutely. The pressure.
It's insane.
Yeah.
So what do you do with this sprawling, completely impossible mandate? Well, you toss the script completely out the window. You take all that massive scale, you throw it away, you focus your lens on a single isolated boat, and in doing so, almost entirely by accident and sheer desperation, you invent modern cinema.
Yeah, it really is the ultimate story of constraint breeding innovation. I mean, you're commissioned to build this sprawling multi-city monument, and instead, you forge a scalpel, like a tiny, incredibly sharp instrument that cuts so deeply it permanently alters the DNA of visual storytelling.
Exactly. We're looking at that exact pressure cooker. We're diving into a film that, routinely tops the lists of the most important movies ever made, the 1925 Soviet silent film Battleship Potemkin, directed by Sergei Eisenstein.
Which is just a fascinating subject.
Right, and we are pulling our insights today primarily from the historical records of the era and this fascinating, incredibly detailed breakdown in the book
Cinema, The Magic Vehicle, A Comprehensive Guide. Journey 1, 1913 to 1950.
Our mission today is to dissect how Eisenstein manipulated time, how he distorted reality, and how he essentially bypassed the viewer's rational mind to, hack their nervous system through editing.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. We are going to explore whether this director was a visionary architect of a completely new visual language or, perhaps an arrogant manipulator.
And we are going to look at how a completely fabricated, seemed-like a total ground-up work of fiction became one of the most famous historical touchstones in the entire world.
Yeah.
But here is the hook for you, the listener, the paradox we're going to be wrestling with today. The most famous, visceral, gut-wrenching 6 minutes of this gritty, so-called documentary-style historical film never actually happened.
It's a profound contradiction, really, that sits right at the center of cinematic history. I mean, think about it. A film commissioned specifically to commemorate actual concrete historical events reaches its absolute emotional zenith through an unvarnished fabrication.
Right, but wait, so you're telling me the technique every modern action blockbuster uses to make our hearts race was invented a century ago by a guy trying to meet a government deadline. I just want to clarify the stakes here for everyone listening, because this sounds almost too modern to be true.
But that is the reality of the situation. To truly understand the leap Eisenstein made, we have to put ourselves inside that specific 1925 pressure cooker. Let's revisit that decree from the leaders of Soviet cinema. They wanted a film to commemorate the 1905 uprising, and they wanted a panoramic epic.
Right, and epic back then meant something very specific. Like the source material mentions they were aiming for something on the scale of Fritz Lang's Nibelungen. Now, if you haven't seen Nibelungen, it is this massive, sprawling, mythological German epic. It was the cinematic equivalent of building the pyramids.
The scale is just staggering.
Right. We are talking about colossal physical sets, thousands of human extras, stories spanning vast amounts of time and geography. That was the benchmark. That was what the Soviet leaders wanted, to capture the sheer scale of 1905.
Yeah, they envisioned a film that would cover the entire revolution. They wanted to track these vast historical movements across multiple cities, showing the interconnected skirmishes, the political debates, the sweeping changes across the entire nation.
Which sounds impossible.
It does, and they delivered this mandate in June with a non-negotiable deadline. The finished film had to be ready for its premiere by December of that same year.
6 months. I mean, let's just think about the physical reality of that for a second. 6 months is an impossibly tight turnaround for a feature film today, right?
No.
And we have digital editing, pre-visualization software, instantaneous communication, all of that.
Oh, today it would be a nightmare.
Exactly. And in 1925, you are shooting on volatile, flammable celluloid. You are physically cutting strips of film with scissors and gluing them together. You are hauling massive, heavy, hand-cranked cameras around without the benefit of modern lighting rigs or sound synchronization. It's insane.
The logistics alone of coordinating thousands of extras across multiple cities in a 6-month window using 1920s transportation and communication, it would have guaranteed failure. It was a doomed project from the start.
Right.
But this impossible deadline is exactly the catalyst for the entire masterpiece. It forced Eisenstein to make a radical pivot, partly by intuition, partly by, sheer survival instinct. He looks at this sprawling mandate and realizes it is a suicide mission.
He has to.
Yeah. So he abandons the massive Nibelungen-style scope completely. He zooms all the way in. He decides to focus almost entirely on one specific incident, which is a mutiny on a single ship of the Black Sea Fleet.
The Prince Potemkin of Taurus, which, by the way, was commissioned in 1904, named after an 18th century admiral. It's literally just one battleship.
Just one ship. And by making that choice, he saves the project. I mean, consider what happens when a creator is given unlimited time and unlimited resources to make a sprawling historical epic.
Oh, we've all seen those movies.
Right.
They usually turn into bloated, unfocused messes. You end up with a narrative featuring like 20 main characters, and you don't care about a single one of them because the director is too busy showing off how many exotic locations they managed to shoot in.
Exactly.
If Eisenstein had been given 5 years and a blank check, he might have tried to film every single street skirmish, every political speech, every minor player in the entire 1905 revolution. It would have been a 5-hour history textbook projected on a screen.
And no one would watch it today. The strict constraint of time and resources is what forged the film's razor-sharp focus. Instead of a sprawling, multi-city historical epic that just dilutes its own impact, we are given something incredibly concentrated. We get this claustrophobic, tension-filled drama confined for a significant portion of its runtime, strictly to the metal decks, the cramped sleeping quarters, and the boiler rooms of a single warship.
I was thinking about this while going through the notes, and it struck me that this is basically the 1925 cinematic version of a television bottle episode.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it. I like the sound of that. Walk us through how a bottle episode functions, for context.
Well, if you watch modern television, a bottle episode happens when a production runs out of budget toward the end of a season.
Okay.
They can't afford to build new sets, they can't afford to hire guest stars or shoot on location. So they literally trap their main characters in one single room, like a stuck elevator or a basement or a living room, and they just let them interact.
Right, they force the drama.
Exactly. And almost every single time, because the writers and directors have to rely purely on character tension and psychological pressure rather than, explosions or scenery changes, it ends up being the most intense, critically acclaimed episode of the entire season. You strip away the scale, and you are forced to focus entirely on the human pressure cooker.
That is an excellent framework for understanding this film. Eisenstein was forced into creating a historical bottle episode, but doing so presents a massive narrative challenge, right?
Now, how do you pull that off?
Exactly. How do you take a single isolated mutiny on one ship and make it feel like an epic historical tragedy? If you have thrown away the vast scope of the entire Russian Revolution, how do you make the audience feel the weight of an entire nation's history within the confines of one small, floating metal space?
Right, because you can't just point a camera at angry sailors and hope the audience grasps the geopolitical implications. You have to build the emotional arc like a mathematical equation.
And that leads us to the fundamental architecture of the film. According to the analysis in cinema, The Magic Vehicle, Eisenstein based the film heavily on the rigid rules of classical tragedy. He didn't just string scenes together randomly, he divided the film strictly into 5 distinct parts.
Very much like a traditional Shakespearean play, right? 5 acts.
Exactly 5. And each of these 5 parts acts as a completely separate, structurally sound whole. Each part has its own internal exposition, its own rising action, its own culmination, and its own solution.
Wow.
The book describes this as an almost mathematically rigorous composition, something that was virtually unmatched in cinema at the time. This rigid framework is the secret engine of the film. It provides a sturdy enough foundation that the visual language can be incredibly dynamic, chaotic, and spontaneous without the film ever losing its structural integrity.
Let's actually dive into the mechanics of that math. I want to look closely at parts 1 and 2, because this is where the mutiny actually breaks out on the ship.
Right.
And here is where Eisenstein's genius for visual storytelling becomes really apparent. I mean, think about how a lesser director might stage the inciting incident of a grand historical revolution.
They'd make it very wordy.
Exactly. They would probably use a soaring political speech or a secret meeting where a manifesto is read aloud. It would be intellectual.
But Eisenstein bypasses the intellect entirely. The inciting incident is meat.
Oh God, the meat. Verminous, maggot-infested meat hanging from hooks.
It is the most visceral bodily insult you can present to a human being. The sailors are presented with their daily rations, and the meat is literally crawling with maggots.
It's disgusting.
It is. The men are disgusted and refuse to eat it. And in this moment, Eisenstein brilliantly uses the hierarchy of the ship as a microcosm for the entire oppressive Russian state.
Right, because the ship's doctor is brought down to the galley.
Yes, he inspects the meat through his pince-nez glasses, clearly sees the vermin writhing around, but officially and falsely declares the meat clean and fit to eat.
He is the embodiment of the corrupt intellectual class,
Right.
just protecting the institution over the physical well-being of the actual people.
Exactly, and the sailors facing starvation or disease maintain their refusal. So the captain of the ship orders the ultimate terrifying escalation. He orders the execution of the complainers to restore order.
And the way this sequence is constructed, it creates an unbelievable level of tension. You know, the dissenting men lined up on the deck, a massive canvas tarpaulin is brought out and thrown over them.
Which is such a striking image.
It really is, isolating them, essentially turning them into ghosts before they are even dead. The firing squad is called to order. They raise their rifles. It's the ultimate standoff between the vulnerable individual and the unfeeling, oppressive machine of the state. And then the system just shatters.
Right.
The firing squad simply lowers their weapons. They refuse to shoot their own comrades.
That singular moment of refusal is the pivot point of the entire revolution. The smell of authority is broken and all hell breaks loose on the deck.
Utter chaos.
The officers, who just moments ago held absolute, unquestioned power over life and death, are hunted down and thrown overboard by the furious, awakened crew. But this sudden freedom comes with a profound cost.
Yeah.
Vakulinchuk, the sailor who acted as the moral center, the one who actively exhorted the firing squad to disobey their orders, is killed in the chaos. He is shot dead by the chief officer, Gilyrovsky.
So, just analyzing parts 1 and 2, we can see that complete 5-act arc playing out in miniature.
Yeah.
You have the exposition of the ship's conditions, the inciting incident of the meat, the culmination of the mutiny on the deck, and the tragic solution of Vakulinchuk's death.
Exactly, the math works perfectly.
But going through the source material, something really struck me about how these characters are handled. We just named Vakulinchuk, played by the actor Alexander Antonov, and we named the chief officer Gilyrovsky, played by Grigory Alexandrov, and Commander Golikov, played by Vladimir Barsky. But the book is very explicit about a radical psychological choice Eisenstein made regarding these characters.
Yes, he maintained the preservation of classical dramatic construction, but he did it entirely without an individual hero.
Which is a huge risk. I mean, if there is no main character for me to latch onto, if there's no singular protagonist whose internal journey I am tracking, how does it not just feel like watching a dry historical newsreel?
It's a fair question.
Like, how does a filmmaker keep a viewer emotionally invested for over an hour when you don't give them a hero to read for? In almost every story we consume, we need a guide. You know, we need a Luke Skywalker or Katniss Everdeen, someone whose eyes we can see the revelation through.
But that departure from the norm is the brilliance of what Eisenstein was attempting. He fundamentally did not want you to identify with one single man's struggle. He wanted you to identify with the struggle of an entire movement.
Okay, so the group itself is the character.
Yes. The masses themselves become the protagonist of the film. Those actors we mentioned, Antonov, Barsky, they aren't treated as traditional stars in the way Hollywood was beginning to define the term. Their specific faces are utilized to represent much broader historical forces.
I see.
The sailor isn't just one man, he is all oppressed workers. The captain isn't just one bad boss, he is the avatar of all aristocratic tyranny.
So when Vakulinchuk dies, you aren't supposed to be mourning Vakulinchuk, the individual guy who maybe, I don't know, had a family and liked to play cards on Tuesdays.
Right.
You are mourning Vakulinchuk as the fallen avatar of the working class.
Exactly. And that concept of the collective hero leads us seamlessly into part 3 of the film. This section is entirely focused on mourning, but it is mourning that is methodically weaponized into political action.
Okay, let's paint the visual picture for part 3. The mutiny is successful, and the Potemkin sails into Odessa harbor. Vakulinchuk's body is brought ashore and laid out in a tent on the wharf. And the cinematography here is incredibly striking.
Oh, it's beautiful.
It's fog-bound, it's visually very somber, very atmospheric, almost ghostly. And the citizens of Odessa, hearing what happened, start to gather around the body.
It begins as a slow trickle of curious onlookers and mourners, and it rapidly becomes a massive flood of humanity.
Just a sea of people.
Yeah, the people come to pay their respects to this fallen sailor. But as the crowd grows, that collective grief very quickly curdles into kinetic anger.
Right.
The popular anger mounts, and the film captures this rising tide of emotion perfectly. It culminates in a deeply symbolic moment where the red flag is hoisted on the battleship.
And the book highlights a specific quote from Eisenstein here that I think perfectly encapsulates his philosophy. He says, "There is no art without conflict."
Yes, and the truly fascinating element is not just that there is conflict in the narrative, but how he conveys that conflict to the viewer.
What do you mean?
Well, the conflict isn't just happening between the characters on the screen. The conflict is happening in the very physical, mechanical construction of the film itself.
Oh, interesting.
To grasp this, we really must delve into the profound influence of a filmmaker and theorist named Sergei Vertov and his concept of the cinema eye.
Okay, yeah, I read about the cinema eye in the notes, but I need you to break down what that actually means in practice. Like, what does a cinema eye look like on a film set in 1925?
Sure. So prior to this era of Soviet montage, cinema was largely treated as an extension of the stage play. A director would put a camera on a wooden tripod, point it at a built set, and the actors would walk in and out of the static frame.
Like watching a play from the front row.
Exactly. It was essentially just a mechanical recording of reality, treating the camera as a passive observer in the fourth wall. But Vertov's cinema eye theory advocated for something radically different and aggressive.
Okay.
He argued that the camera lens, the mechanical cinema eye, was actually superior to the flawed human eye. It could see things we couldn't.
How so?
Well, it could freeze time, it could speed it up, it could look incredibly closely at a detail. Therefore, he argued, the filmmaker shouldn't just passively record reality. They should actively break filmed reality into dozens, even hundreds of fragmented individual shots.
I mean, you don't just shoot a wide shot of a crowd.
Right.
You photograph the event from wildly different distances and angles. You grab an extreme close-up of a fist, a wide shot of the sky, a low angle of a boot. You literally shatter the scene into 100 different visual puzzle pieces.
And then the true art happens in the editing room. You take those hundreds of celluloid puzzle pieces and you put them back together. But you don't arrange them chronologically to recreate the reality of the day. You arrange them rhythmically to manipulate human psychology.
So what does that psychological manipulation actually feel like for the viewer sitting in a dark theater in 1925?
It means they are experiencing a fundamentally new, almost somatic way of receiving information.
And a physical reaction.
Yes. When those citizens are gathering in the fog in Odessa, the masterly buildup of pathos and tension isn't achieved because the actors are delivering impassioned monologues or crying harder on screen. The emotional temperature is raised entirely by the editor manually increasing the pace of the editing.
The physical cuts between the shots get faster.
They get faster and shorter. And interspersed with this are dramatic, weaponized uses of title cards. You know, the text on the screen flashing in a specific rhythmic cadence.
Oh, yeah.
This technique physically alters the emotional state of the viewer. The human brain processes every cut as a new piece of visual information. When those cuts happen in rapid succession, the brain has to work faster to process them, which triggers a physiological response.
Wow.
The rapid-fire cuts literally force your heartbeat to mimic the chaotic, rising tension of a riot.
He is hacking the audience's nervous system.
He is.
And I have to point out to you listening, we take this technique completely for granted today. I mean, think about the media you consume right now. We see rapid-fire cuts in TikTok videos, in action movie trailers, in sports highlights, and we assume it's this very modern, short attention span invention.
We really do.
We assume the MTV generation invented rapid editing in the 1980s, but Eisenstein was doing it 100 years ago with scissors and glue. He figured out the underlying biology of it.
That's a great point.
He realized that if you flash a tight 1-second close-up of a clenched fist, then cut immediately to a wide shot of a surging crowd, then cut to a glaring eye, and you time those cuts to an accelerating mathematical rhythm, the viewer's body will react involuntarily.
Yes.
They won't just understand the panic intellectually. They will feel the panic in their chest. They will feel the anger.
He unlocked the realization that the cut itself, the physical splice between two pieces of film, was an active source of energy. It wasn't just a transition, it was a collision.
A collision.
This manipulation of the viewer's pulse through editing, this mathematical acceleration of time and image, all serves as the psychological runway for the absolute culmination of the film.
Which brings us to part 4.
Part 4. This is where the manipulation of the viewer reaches its absolute towering peak. We are talking about what is universally considered the most famous and, as we'll discuss in a moment, arguably the most deceptive 6 minutes in the entire history of cinema.
The Odessa Steps sequence.
Yes.
We really need to dedicate some serious time to unpacking this. Because even if you think you have never seen Battleship Potemkin, you have seen the Odessa Steps. If you have ever watched Brian De Palma's The Untouchables or any parody of an old dramatic movie, you have seen echoes of this exact sequence.
That's everywhere in pop culture.
It is. So let's set the stage. The people of Odessa are in full support of the mutinous sailors. They are gathered on the steps, waving, sending supplies out to the battleship in little skiffs. It's a beautiful, sunlit moment of triumph and cross-class solidarity.
And then the climax arrives. The state violently strikes back to restore order.
Suddenly, at the very top of this massive, seemingly endless, monumental stone staircase leading down to the harbor, the military appears. It is a line of Cossacks wearing these crisp, immaculate white summer tunics, and without warning, they begin to march down the steps into the crowd.
This is where Eisenstein's genius for visual contrast elevates the sequence into high art. He films the advancing Cossacks not as individual men with faces and complex emotions, but as a faceless rhythmic machine.
Yeah, the camera framing deliberately cuts off their heads. You don't see their eyes, you just see their heavy boots marching in perfect, terrifying unison.
Exactly.
You see the long barrels of their rifles pointing down, moving inexorably forward like an unstoppable wall of white fabric and cold steel.
And contrasting that rigid, unfeeling, mechanical wall is the chaotic, desperate, hyper-vulnerable humanity of the crowd fleeing down the stone steps.
The rhythmic editing we just talked about goes into absolute overdrive here.
Yeah.
It is chaotic, it's disorienting, it's terrifying. The cuts become an absolute visual barrage. And amidst this sweeping chaos, we get the specific, agonizingly intimate detail that burned itself into the global consciousness.
Yes. The focus narrows to a single mother, played by Beatrice Vitoldi.
She is standing on the landing of the steps with a baby carriage of pram. The soldiers fire a volley into the fleeing crowd. The mother is mortally wounded. The camera lingers on her face as she falls to the ground in agony.
It's so visceral.
And as her body collapses, she accidentally kicks the wheels of the pram. And the carriage, with the infant inside, begins to bump, 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 rolling down the massive stone steps, completely out of control, right into the military crossfire.
It is pure, concentrated nightmare fuel. It preys on the most primal human fears. But the way Eisenstein achieves this sustained terror isn't just through the shocking imagery, it is through a profound, highly technical manipulation of time itself.
Explain that, because that's huge.
Right. According to the detailed breakdown in cinema, The Magic Vehicle, cinematic time is explicitly expanded in this sequence in a ratio of 3:1 compared to real time.
Let me make sure I understand the mechanic, 3:1. So if the actual physical event running down a flight of stairs would take, say, 2 minutes to complete in real life, Eisenstein uses editing to stretch that exact same action so it takes 6 minutes to unfold on the screen.
That is the mechanism. He drags out the horror to an agonizing length.
But how does he actually do that without it just looking like slow motion?
He achieves this by overlapping the action. So, for example, he will show the pram roll down 3 steps, cut away to the marching boots, cut to a screaming face, and then cut back to the pram, but he rolls the action back slightly so you see the pram hit those same 3 steps again from a different angle.
Oh, wow.
By intercutting all these different fragmented perspectives of the same brief event, he artificially inflates the duration of the massacre. He traps the viewer in that moment of panic, making what should be a brief, chaotic sprint down a staircase feel like a torturous, inescapable eternity.
It is a masterclass in subjective time. But here is the massive historical revelation buried in the text. And this is the part that completely broke my brain when I was preparing for this.
Oh, here we go.
This incredible scene, this flawless, visceral depiction of a historical tragedy is a complete fake.
It is entirely 100% fabricated.
It never happened. The book explicitly states that the scenes on the steps do not correspond to historical reality in any way.
Not at all.
The Cossacks did not march down the Odessa steps in a rigid line and massacre a crowd of civilians. A baby carriage didn't tragically roll down into the crossfire.
Right.
None of it occurred. It wasn't even in the original script.
No. The story goes that Eisenstein visited the city of Odessa, saw this giant, dramatic staircase, and brilliantly devised the massacre on the spot simply because it provided a striking visual geometry that solved his thematic purpose.
Just because it looked good.
Well, he needed a powerful visual metaphor for the crushing weight of the state coming down on the people. A massive descending staircase provided the perfect physical setting to represent that downward oppressive force.
Which brings us perfectly to the friction point of this entire deep dive, because this introduces a massive moral trap for the listener. I have to ask you, and anyone listening to this right now, to consider the ethics of this choice.
It's a complex question.
Right. Is this an example of brilliant filmmaking, or is it just the ultimate 1920s fake news? The goal of the film, as the book openly states, is militant art. It is propaganda designed to fire people up against tyranny. But does it matter that he completely invented a massacre just to make the audience angry? Do you lose the moral high ground when you lie to tell the truth?
Look, from a historical and cinematic standpoint, the research in cinema, the magic vehicle, is spot on here. The authors argue that Eisenstein was attempting to build a completely new visual language, and they are correct in their assessment.
But the manipulation.
They call the film a monumental achievement for a very good reason. He was fusing high, avant-garde art with militant politics because he had the stones to try something nobody else dared to do at the time. You are throwing around terms like fake news, but we have to remember this wasn't just a movie, it was a foundational technical breakthrough.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, but
The way he used those fragmented shots, the rhythmic pacing, the artificial expansion of time, those techniques changed how every single film is made today. It is an evolution of the medium itself. We simply wouldn't have modern visual storytelling without him taking that creative risk on the steps.
I have to argue that the book is being way too kind to him, to be completely honest. You call it ambition and evolution, but looking at his methods, I call it the actions of an absolute egomaniac. I mean, he was just a madman with a megaphone.
That's a bit harsh.
Is it? Just because a director spends a fortune, completely ignores the actual historical record, and likely makes everyone miserable on set, dragging a heavy pram up and down some stone stairs all day, doesn't automatically make him an untouchable genius. He decided his manufactured version of reality was better and more important than the actual history of the people who lived it.
But you're missing the point of the...
He was a proper narcissist with a camera, and I think the book lets him off the hook for this historical manipulation simply because the film is old and carries the label of a classic.
Rubbish. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of his goal. It's not an ego trip, it is an evolution of communication. The book gives you the actual credits, the specific framing choices made by his cinematographer, Edward Tiss. These are technical breakthroughs that required a visionary mind to orchestrate.
But the film is so great.
If you watch the film today and find the sheer scale of it or the deliberate pacing of a silent film a bit of a slog, that reflects poorly on the modern fractured attention span, not on the history of the art form, the context of when and why it was made is what matters.
I'm just saying, I am looking at it with a modern eye, and honestly, the experience of watching it is half brilliant and half nonsense.
Yeah.
The book defends him entirely through this protective historical lens, but I'm sitting here on my couch watching the expanded time sequence thinking, mate, cut 30 minutes out of this endless montage, and we would actually have a compelling, tight story.
You can't just edit down a masterpiece to fit your modern sensibilities.
It is bloated. A film has to be able to stand on its own 2 feet and be engaging without requiring the viewer to have a film history textbook open on their lap just to justify the pacing.
But that deliberate pacing is exactly what the concept of the masses as protagonist required. You cannot capture the immense weight of a societal shift, the agonizing slow burn of a revolution in a tight 90-minute character study.
I disagree.
The duration, the repetition, the mathematical expansion of time that you dismiss as bloat, that is the very mechanism of the militant art the book describes. It takes time to alter a viewer's pulse. You are asking a piece of revolutionary 1920s propaganda to conform to the snappy, instant gratification pacing of a modern popcorn thriller.
No, I am asking a movie to respect my time as a viewer. If a modern director filmed a 6-minute action sequence in slow motion, that was totally, provably historically inaccurate just to manipulate my political feelings, film critics would roast them alive for being self-indulgent and manipulative.
It's completely different contextually.
But because it is in black and white, and because it was released in 1925, the book reveres it as a monumental achievement. I just think we need to separate the historical importance of the editing techniques from the actual experience of sitting down and watching the film today. You can be the guy who invents the hammer, but that doesn't mean the first house you build with it isn't drafty and hard to live in.
That is incredibly dismissive of the fact that this drafty house completely reshaped global consciousness.
Did it, though?
Yes. The manipulation you are decrying was so incredibly effective, the visual language was so potent, that millions of people today genuinely believe the Odessa Steps massacre was a real, documented historical event. It superseded the truth.
Which is exactly my point. He lied so effectively, so beautifully, that his lie actually overwrote reality in the collective memory of the world. Is that the mark of a genius, or is that utterly terrifying?
It is the terrifying, undeniable power of cinema. And that power is exactly why the book and film historians revere it to this day.
Well, we are clearly not going to solve the ethics of historical manipulation today. We will leave that argument unresolved for the listener to chew on. But to properly close out the deep dive, we should briefly conclude the narrative of the film itself, because the story doesn't end on the steps.
Right, there is more.
There is a part V to this mathematical structure, the epilogue.
Yes, part V. After the agonizing horror and chaos of the Odessa Steps, the film's tension peaks one final time. A massive Russian naval squadron is spotted approaching the Potemkin.
The battleship is now commanded by the militant sailor Matushenko, played by Mikhail Gomarov.
The crew is exhausted, and they are anticipating a total slaughter. The approaching squadron has them massively outgunned. It seems like the revolution is about to be crushed at sea, just as it was crushed on the steps.
Yeah.
But as the towering ships approach, the men on the Potemkin run up the flags to signal the word brothers to the approaching fleet.
And we get this incredible, emotionally charged moment of culmination. The 109 heavy guns aimed directly at the Potemkin remain completely silent. They refuse to fire.
It is a massive, fleet-wide echo of the firing squad refusing to shoot in part 2.
Exactly. The sailors on the other ships line the decks and express their solidarity with the revolutionary crew. And the Potemkin, unharmed, triumphantly sails right through the parted fleet, away to the open sea.
It provides a triumphant, unifying, and structurally perfect resolution to the 5-part mathematical tragedy. The individual mutiny becomes a collective victory.
Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought for you to mull over today. The most visceral, globally recognized memory of the 1905 Russian Revolution. A vulnerable baby carriage bumping down some stone steps into a relentless line of gunfire is entirely the fictional creation of a film director who was stressed out trying to meet a December deadline. So look around at the world today. Think about the media you consume. What other historical facts in your own mind, what deep cultural memories that you hold as absolute truth are actually just the result of really, really good editing?
It certainly makes you question the origin of every powerful image you've ever been shown.
We've done 40 of these, so you know we're never going to agree. If you want to see if I am just being a cynical git or if the book actually has it right, buy the thing. The link is in the description. Do you actually have the spine to read the real history, or are you staying lazy? Your call.